This is the Classical Ideas Podcast. Welcome to episode 19 of the Classical Ideas Podcast. This is Greg Soden. If you've been a listener of this podcast from the beginning, you'll remember the discussion about African indigenous religions with Professor David Amponza at the University of Missouri. In my introduction to that episode, I discussed how indigenous religions of Africa, of North America, and more comprise a significant gap in my knowledge, and that a major goal of this podcast for myself was to attempt to close my own knowledge gaps a little bit at a time. So today I'm diving back into the world of indigenous religions, this time of indigenous North Americans. In my own classes, I regrettably have never had an American indigenous presence. Every year my intention is to bring more of a North American indigenous voice into the classroom, because of the significance of the land all North Americans walk upon and drive upon each day. The interpretation of what this land means varies so much across this continent depending on who you ask. I've done some scholarly work around the world of education policy and schooling with regards to how indigenous North Americans are represented in the United States history K-12 learning standards, and collaborated with professors Sarah Shear, Antonio Castro, and Ryan Knowles on a research article entitled Manifesting Destiny, Representations of Indigenous Peoples in K-12 U.S. History Standards, published by Theory and Research in Social Education in 2015. But since I've become a religious studies teacher, my knowledge of indigenous North American religions has remained painfully oblivious, so I started seeking guests to help me fill in this gap. And I found one. I found Professor Dennis Kelley from the University of Missouri, who has accepted my invitation to be on the podcast and also to visit my students in my high school classroom. Dennis Kelley is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Missouri-Columbia. He received his master's and doctorate from the University of California, Santa Barbara, with emphases in American Indian religious traditions, religion in American culture, and myth and ritual theory. His most recent major publication was his book, Tradition, Performance, and Religion in Native America, subtitle Ancestral Ways, Modern Selves, and he's currently working on a book tentatively titled Having Had a Spiritual Reawakening, subtitle Religion and Alcohol Addiction Recovery in Indian Country. He teaches several core courses at Mizzou, including Introduction to Religion, Religious Myth and Ritual, and Indigenous Religions, as well as American Indian Religious Traditions and Religion and Humor. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Dennis Kelley. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. This is Greg Soden, and I'm here today with Professor Dennis Kelley. So, you write in the introduction to Tradition, Performance, and Religion in Native America, published in 2015, and you state that there are, quote, assumptions about religion in indigenous cultures as being fairly simplistic and therefore prone to pre-contact stasis and to erosion from newer, non-indigenous ideas will be refuted. And then you go on to say that, quote, indigenous religious traditions adhere to some of the same operational principles as other religious systems in the modern world. So this quote really grabbed me, and to me this means that listeners who know a lot about Native American indigenous religious traditions, or traditions in general, if they know nothing, they can still see indigenous traditions in new and deep ways. And for those who are experts, they can still see it in new and deep ways because they can make connections to the society around us. So to me, this quote is sort of an open invitation to the curious to ask questions. So you want to begin?
Sure. Sounds
awesome. Good. So why don't you go ahead and start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you became a religious studies professor?
I often think about that myself, actually, because the draw to it, I think, the study of religion, probably from my upbringing in a really diverse neighborhood. I grew up in a low-income housing project, and so a lot of the people that I hung around with their families were Buddhist, AME. I had some friends from India who were Hindu. I had a couple of other Native friends as well in this sort of housing project, and so I think that there's a part of me that feels like I always had some sense of religious diversity and being interested in what other people do, hanging around in their houses and with their families and whatnot. And so when I finally got a chance to go to college, I didn't start college until I was 30. I had traveled around the Western U.S. looking for jobs and work and that kind of thing, and encountering people from all across sort of economic, social, educational, ethnic, and religious boundaries. That just I had that kind of a life, I think. And so by the time I got a chance to study people for a living, I think that the idea that religion was one of the best sort of windows to look into the building of a culture with. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Sure.
But because I always tell my students, if you have a building that's like a human culture, and there are windows that people look into it through, the economics window, the philosophy window, the anthropology window, I always picture religious studies as a like a big picture window that takes in the gaze of a lot of the others, because it's economic, it's political, it's ethnic, it's social, and so I think that I was naturally drawn to it as a way to get at a lot of sort of social issues on the ground, I think.
So growing up in that diverse environment, did you have the sort of relationships and friendships where you could like openly ask questions about what it meant to be Buddhist or what it meant to be AME or anything like that?
Sure, yeah. In fact, that the my first real girlfriend was AME, and her family, so African American, obviously, and they went to church a lot, all the time, and I went with them. But there was one sort of controversial member of her mom's family, a brother of hers, so my girlfriend's uncle, who had converted to Islam, so he belonged to the Nation of Islam. And so that was this controversial sort of issue. And so for me, it was really asking why that was such an issue, what the problem was about it. And so those kinds of issues-oriented, I think, questions sort of arose. My friend that was Buddhist, Tram, his family had been airlifted from Vietnam at the fall of Saigon, at the end of the war, end of the Vietnam War. And so he was a little kid, a little baby, essentially evacuated off the roof of a building in Saigon. And so knowing that was an issue, that sort of his Buddhist family that had felt persecution under the Catholic government of Vietnam at one time, that those kinds of things just sort of opened themselves up, I think, for questions. And as much as people knew, I guess I was a kind of a curious, nerdy kid as it was. So I would go look things up. We had this big, because it was way before Google, obviously. So there was we had this big sort of encyclopedia collection. My mom would always just say, "Go look it up." I don't know, go look it up. And so I would, go find these things out.
So I know that you're mostly a specialist in your scholarly areas of indigenous American religions. What drew you to indigenous American religious traditions?
Again, I think it was my experience in my home family compared to the people around me. So both of my grandmothers being Native, but also devoutly Catholic, that there was a kind of an interest with how people were indigenizing Catholicism, I guess, or how my aunts and uncles and my parents' generation were still sort of seeing themselves as being, enmeshed in these sort of land, more localized traditions, in addition to feeling fully Catholic, fully members of that sort of tradition. And so I think that was part of my sort of understanding of it, was this sense of sort of that identification with with one and the other, that got me to really wonder about what indigeneity meant in the modern world. And that sort of has driven my scholarship ever since, really, I think.
Fantastic. So let's dive into the American indigenous religious traditions. So can you briefly describe some of the diversity of American indigenous religious traditions?
It's kind of difficult to put them all out there. There are so many. There are literally hundreds of federally recognized tribes, and then hundreds more that go unrecognized, and then hundreds in addition that were essentially sort of killed off, rubbed out with contact. And so the best thing, I think, would be to think regionally, that if you were to think of like the Southwest, that you can sort of imagine an arid region, high desert, that the culture is associated with those places, Apache, Navajo, Zuni, the Pueblos in general, that those tribes sort of have a lot in common because of the nature of the landscape. But if you were to move then to the northeastern seaboard, a completely different environment, and producing completely different sort of tribal lifeways associated with that kind of environment. And so if you sort of break the country up, in fact, a friend and colleague of mine, one of the first things I ever did professionally in terms of publishing was a 3-volume encyclopedia on American Indian religious traditions. And one of the first problems we encountered was how to divide the country up, how to divide all these tribes into at least some workable grouping. And so we use these sort of geographic zones, ecological zones, because the relationship between indigenous people and the natural cycles of their place is what kind of drives their philosophical systems and traditions. And so that you can sort of think about high desert southwestern people are sort of like desert people, that a lot of their traditions revolve around water and rain and seasonal cycles of monsoon and then drought, and so sort of figuring out how to think about the world with regard to making it produce in those sort of short periods, versus someplace like the Pacific Northwest, where they've got a sort of particular relationship with the salmon, for example, and that the cycle of the salmon's life and the way that the rivers run wild and crazy after the spring runoff, and then sort of ebbing down, only to sort of become wild and crazy in the spring again. There's sort of cycles of life that sort of drive their philosophical systems. I don't know if that makes sense, but in relationship with particular places, these sort of systems come about, I think.
So now that we've got the listener thinking geographically, thinking regionally, let's dive into some of like the basics of indigenous religious traditions. So what are some introductory basics that people with zero knowledge should know about American indigenous religious traditions? Like, what are some of the roles of important people? Is it theistic? Things like that.
I think that the best way to think about it, again, because of the wide variety and the differences, and the fact that they're so diverse, would be to think in terms of the things that they have in common. And to me, I always talk about it with regard to three, I call them the 3 Ps, place, power, and protocol. Place, that just what I was talking about, that relationship with specific places and the deep sort of intimate regard for the cycles of nature and the animistic nature of it, that the landscape itself is sort of conscious. There are multiple consciousnesses out there, that human beings are the only one of the groups that have consciousness in the world. The animals and plants and natural phenomenon. And so a relationship to a particular place. Power, the idea that there's a sacred power that runs through those places, is pretty much ubiquitous throughout American Indian traditions generally, that there's some sense of a unifying sacred that either is envisioned as a wind or as some other sort of flowing energy that's not at all unlike qi in Taoism, sort of this naturally sort of flowing energy that everyone is able to plug into. And then the third thing, the protocol, that because of the relationship between the places and the other than human world and the sacred powers that unite us, there's this sense of a proper way to behave, the proper time and place to do things, proper roles that people have, proper relationships that they adhere to, ceremonially speaking, that we have a certain responsibility to certain kinds of things. And so I think, and I don't usually say all or never or any of those sort of totalizing things, but very nearly all American Indian religious traditions have some sense of a proper way to live in the world. The Lakota call it the red road, the road of righteousness, the proper way to do things given our responsibility and given the fact that we aren't the only consciousnesses around, that we have responsibilities.
So I want to dive into a specific example of that, of place and then that sacred power of a place. So if we picture something that's been in the news the last couple of years, whether it be Keystone XL, whether it be Dakota access, pipelines that run across sacred lands, can you kind of take us into the thinking of what that would look like with regards to the sacred place and the possibility of damaging it irreparably?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think that the pipeline is a great example. That Dakota access, that the awareness of it. I mean, politically speaking, I think it's pretty obvious when it's being built near non-native communities, and they complain because of the concerns over the obvious environmental harm that can be done. It gets moved away and gets moved toward Indians, and that's a fairly common event in Indian country, that placing things near Indians because that they aren't seen as being as worthy of that kind of concern. But for the natives themselves, to see themselves as not just protecting their individual sort of tribal territories, but rather they're protecting the water, that they even refer to themselves as water protectors, that there's a responsibility to this resource, that a responsibility that it's there for people 7 generations into the future, that a sense that because of this being their place and the sacred nature of life and the form of water, and that water itself has this sort of sacred role to play, that clearly then it's going to be their responsibility in terms of protocol to be the protectors of that resource. And so they're doing the same thing that their ancestors would have done ceremonially from time immemorial. I've got a chapter in the book about the idea of protest as ceremony, that you participate in the cycles of the world somehow, that there's always in every tribal community that I've ever been in touch with, there's some ceremonial relationship between the people and the powers of that place, and you have a responsibility to keep up that your end of the bargain. It's almost a chore that you do. And it's in I would say the late 19th through to now the 21st century, that American Indians have involved themselves in putting themselves in harm's way oftentimes, and we saw that with the pipeline protests, that's almost a ritual act, almost a religious act, to place themselves in some position to protect that resource, because they've always seen themselves in that role, protecting these resources, and not just for themselves, but for, like I said, 7 generations into the future, that this is a sacred obligation, I guess, to protest.
So a question springing to mind here. So maintaining an indigenous identity in the 21st century, it cannot be easy. So what are some of the challenges to maintaining these indigenous traditions as we move forward in 2017, 2018, into the future?
It's interesting because I think it's probably easier than we give it credit for, that in a lot of ways that the dynamic nature of culture in general, human beings, that we change and adapt and change over time, that we aren't shocked that we don't go around and with buckles on our shoes and using Old English like the colonial times. And so that the reason, I don't know why we would expect the native people to be the same as they were 200 years ago, 250 years ago. And so their religious traditions, and one of the reasons why I think studying religion through the lens of Native America is such an interesting thing, is that the trappings of religion, the kinds of things that we think of as being religion, the beliefs, are often we allow them to be overshadowed by overshadow the actual sort of relationships that people have as a result of them. So in other words, that religion, if nothing else, is about forming and maintaining community identities over time. And so that the religious practices can sort of change to a certain degree, but those deeply held values are what's sort of seen as the constant. And so if you have a contemporary tribal group that no longer can practice their ceremony in exactly the same way as their ancestors did, they still maintain those practices, just maybe in somewhat modified forms. If that makes sense.
Sure.
And that sort of the change over time then is that whether you urbanized tribes, whether the cities have grown up around your tribal traditions, like places like I'm familiar with out in Los Angeles, and places like Santa Barbara, California, where the city sort of has grown up in your sacred area, or other places where you've been removed to them, like the Cherokees being moved to Oklahoma, or whether you've just dispersed as individuals leave to find jobs from the reservation to find themselves in like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or St. Louis, Missouri, that you look for people that share those common values, I think. And it's interesting to think about American Indians as indigenous, sort of indigenous actors in the modern world. That what's rising, I think, around the world, I see anyway, is a consciousness, indigenous people needing to develop an ideology, I think, of not only protecting the environmental resources, which is part of it, but also the responsibilities that go into that behavior really goes to being a good person, and that people wanting to raise their kids in ways that have them, connected to these larger ancestral traditions, and the sense of responsibility and pride that comes from being an ancient people that has adapted over time. And that's why I in that quote you started with, that it's not that different than a lot of contemporary religious traditions. If you see people that they're contemporary, like Muslim people here on campus, or people that practice Zen Buddhism, there's ancient traditions there, but they just do it in a way that they're able to interact with the modern world in ways that aren't diminishing their sense of sacred values.
That's fantastic. So, in your view, what is the goal or purpose of American Indian or indigenous religious traditions? So, what's being sought after?
I think that it goes to, like I said, the very nature of religion in general, that this idea of establishing and maintaining a collective identity and some sense of continued shared purpose, I think, that people look for deeper connections between themselves and other people that they can sustain over time. I think it's inherent in our species, really, in my opinion, that we sort of developed as a social animal. And so in a lot of ways that especially contemporary American Indian traditions are an attempt to get back at what they see as being those kinds of anchors in community, in family, in places, and then the relationships and responsibilities that go along with those things. And so ultimately, I think the goal is to maintain some sense of a communal identity and a value system that they see as inherently their responsibility, given their connection to particular places.
So I noticed that you haven't said anything about God or theism at all. Is there any kind of theistic notion to indigenous religions?
Well, many tribes do. There's a wide variety. That some traditions, like my great grandma's people, there's a deity that sort of Kakuna Mawa he's known as, but sort of the mystery behind the sun. The sun is his torch, and yet there's a whole pantheon of other beings that sort of exist in the sort of celestial realm that are often propitiated for different reasons and at different times. Then there are other traditions where there are multiple deities, and that the people sort of focus on one goddess figure, like Isana Klesh for the Apaches. There's a kind of a sort of a goddess figure of creation, sort of an earth goddess. In other traditions, it's kind of like a committee that their creation stories start with a group of beings that essentially create together collectively, and so it really varies from tribe to tribe, region to region. But I think that the idea of a spiritual being, a sacred being, or multiple beings is probably pretty ubiquitous, that there are various gods and spirits around. But most of them are available in a more intimate sort of way, that there's a way to interact with spirits, that there's the Ojibwe have a concept, Manitou, that the spirits that are associated with the various things in the world, and that you sort of propitiate them as part of your day-to-day life. That's what you do. That it's the only the proper thing to do, given the fact that they do these things for you. Water and sort of the fur-bearing animals that would be trapped, or food resources, that you owe something back for all these gifts that you're given, and that it's kind of an exchange kind of.
Let's get comparative for a second. So if you think about all the religions in the world, the roughly 4,200 or so, I think, that are named and listed, what do you like the most about indigenous religions whenever you think about it as a world religion?
I think the locative nature of it, that there's a guy called Jonathan Z. Smith that talks about the two basic divisions in worldviews around the globe. One, utopian, so thinking in terms of like the Abrahamic God created the entire universe, or Buddhism, that the Buddha nature is the entire universe, versus locative ones, where the traditions are associated with specific places and communities. And so what I enjoy about learning about indigenous religions generally is how they bring people back to some sort of responsibility one to another of much more smaller sort of sustainable cultures. And that, to me, in a lot of ways, what we may be lacking in this modern world is that sense of the local and being responsible. That might be partially because I'm from this neighborhood, this sort of low-income housing project where everybody knew everybody's business, where it can feel stifling at times. When I was a kid, I can see the benefit of knowing that there was a safety in the fact that at any point someone could pop open the door of their apartment and yell at us for doing something wrong, and our parents would thank them for it, right? Mm-hmm. That we were a much more sort of, I don't know, it was like a village, really, in a lot of ways. And so I think that's what I admire most, is that sense of, because I was telling my students just the other day, we were talking about this idea of that it takes a village to raise a child, you know? Mm-hmm. And some kids bristle at that. They have some sense of, but it should be my right, my responsibility. And what I said was, I'm not sure if anybody is not raised by a village. It just depends on what that village is. It could be the internet. It could be whatever, pop culture or something. Mm-hmm. That our kids are being raised in some sort of a network where there's influence beyond our own families. And the strength of the family influence is what's going to keep kids from being, I think, unduly influenced by some of the more negative kinds of things out there, I think.
You know, like, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and when I was 27, I moved to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I did a master's degree at the University of Saskatchewan. And there's a huge place-based, environmentally aware education department at that university in their college of education. And it wasn't until I moved there and I started studying with, there's an Indigenous professor up there named Marie Batiste, who's Mi'kmaq from the east coast of Canada. And I had another friend who is Cree up there, and they started talking about what it meant to live in a place and what it meant to like be attached to a physical piece of earth. And like it started to inspire me a little bit. And I noticed that I was looking at the world different. I was walking physically different. If I was walking through a park, I would be a little different in the way that I would move around. And the power of thinking locally, the power of thinking place-based is really inspiring. And I think that's a concept that can be attached to anybody in our society, whether they're Indigenous or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the goal of sort of contemporary indigeneity, is really to sort of reintroduce people to this amazing feature of our planet, and that's the natural world, the natural cycles of it, and recognizing our responsibility to maintain those relationships, I think.
Yeah, just think about how you're moving around in the world.
Yeah.
What kind of energy do you want to leave behind you?
Right. Yeah.
So let's get nerdy. So who are some of your favorite scholars, writers, thinkers, anybody related to Indigenous religious traditions of any kind that you would like to recommend to anybody who wants to know more?
Well, I think that there's a couple of sort of classic books that can really, I think, turn people's heads. And one of them is a book that's by a guy called Vine Deloria Jr. called God is Red. And that when that book came out, it's an older book now, and he's passed away. I think for a lot of people caused them to stand up straight. Sit up straight. Vine Deloria Jr. was trained not only in sort of anthropological theory, but also theology and the law, and so he had the ability. He was sort of a Renaissance man, kind of sort of able to think in all these different directions, so I think that if people wanted to read that book, there's a lot of unfortunately there are so many, and I don't want to leave anybody off, because my friend Suzanne Crawford O'Brien has a couple of books out that are sort of overarching treatments of Native America and generally that I think are good. There's a book called Looking East from Indian Country that's good, that sort of thinks about how American Indians see the world in this sort of post-Columbian world. There's also one called 1491 that does the same thing, what things were like at one point. There's so many. Yeah. But because I happen to be more of a religious studies nerd too, and so I think that there are a lot of things about religion, and I had mentioned J.Z. Smith's book, and so I think that if you were to look at, he's got a book called, the name is flown right out of my head. I should have had some notes, but anything by him, actually, they're all fairly small books. From Babylon to Jonestown was the one I was thinking of.
Excellent.
That sort of talks about the idea of religion, and that to me, that if you put those things together and think about how American Indians are being religious in the same way that other people are being religious, and that how American Indians have sort of indigenized Western traditions, especially Christianity, that you start to see how people then utilize these concepts semiotically to sort of make meaning with them. That just like a Lakota might see Jesus as a sun dancer, like an ultimate sort of sacrifice on dancing for the people kind of sacrifice, that same kind of thing can happen both ways. That Christians, I think, can learn a bit about how Christianity works by how indigenous people, especially Native Americans, have made something of it. We were just talking yesterday about, or I keep saying yesterday, Friday, about the Native American church, sort of a Christian-oriented church, and yet completely native insofar as that peyote is used as a sacrament in that tradition, and so decidedly non-Christian, and yet for them it's very much about the same sort of Christian gospel that everybody else sort of reads and adheres to. And so for me, I think that that's part of what's interesting to me is that if people can sort of think about religion differently, that it's not just a set of beliefs, but rather what collectively people do together, I think, also, that it's not just what an individual person has or believes, but what we collectively do together, given those beliefs. I think it's the other part that often gets missing, I think.
What do you think are some major misconceptions that modern Westerners have about indigenous traditions?
I think that they're primitive or simple. That's the thing that from the 19th century to the mid to late 20th century, that even people in academia would sort of look at American Indian traditions as a simple laboratory to understand religion generally, that their religions are simple forms of what we have in more complex forms. And so I think that the idea in academia has gone away, but that it remains in a lot of people's heads, that there's some sense of that it's superstition and that kind of thing, that it's simplistic. And I think that not only does it not do justice to the native traditions themselves, but also sort of cuts you off to learning more about people in our midst and how they're dynamic and growing and complex people generally. And it's too easy for us to think other people's beliefs are superstitions and incorrect, but our beliefs are true and real. And that if we have some sense of sort of opening up ourselves to think about everybody's traditions as having value, not only I think do we get along better, but we learn from each other better, I think, too. And sort of understanding that American Indians are still around, that their traditions are growing, and that in a lot of ways there are more people oriented toward their native traditions, languages, cultures now than there were at the turn of the last century. 1890s was a sort of a nadir for American Indians, and experiencing open aggression and genocidal practices, and that those that the fact that American Indians are sort of back to some sort of solid footing, as insofar as they are in Indian country, is just an amazing testament to their communities, really.
So this is going to be the final question, but as a religious studies professor who teaches hundreds of people per year, what do you tell your students about why it's important to learn about all religions?
To me, that there's two main things. One, in the humanities in general, the ability to sort of take an idea and explore it without feeling like you have to make a judgment on it, or either adopt it or reject it. If you can just explore it, that skill, I think, is essential just across the board. And so religions are a great place where students can sort of, whatever their predisposed ideas are, whether they're believers in one or another religion, or whether they're opposed to any kind of religion at all, because they run the gamut here at Mizzou, that if they can look at religions and see them in their context and see them as valid expressions, that it gives them, I think it hones those skills generally. That's the one thing. And the other thing is that religious literacy, I think, is it's an essential skill to have, given the diverse nature of the world, that it's just getting smaller and smaller all the time, and that people are expecting students to come out of public institutions with some awareness of the world, and that religions are both an interesting way, but also, as I said before, a broad window to glimpse into other cultures. And so if you understand Shinto, you can get a lot more out of what you understand about Japan. Mm-hmm. If you can understand Taoism, then you can kind of understand where Chinese culture is, and sort of in the hinterland, if it's not necessarily the government position, or Catholicism in Mexico, or wherever, that you can sort of think with religions in a way that really is, I find helpful. It's a helpful data set that it's kind of like, I don't know, kind of like algebra, that then you can sort of go on to calculus and statistics and things like that, because you have that foundation. And I think that religion's part of that foundation, really.
Well, this has really been a pleasure. I have learned a lot today. So thank you so much for coming on the Classical Ideas podcast and having this conversation with me.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. The Classical Ideas podcast is written and performed by me, Greg Soden. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. His music can be found at www.wearewarmmusic.com. Thanks for listening.